Next up, we'll move to our contested U.S. congressional candidates, specifically Congressional District 6. This congressional office is currently held by Karen Handel, and this year we have 4 Democratic candidates that are looking to unseat her. Those candidates are Kevin Abel, who is not here with us today, Stephen Griffin Knight, Bobby Capel, and Lucy McBath. United States Georgia congressional delegation is made up of 14 congressmen, of which 4 are Democrats. Also referred to as congressmen or congresswomen, each representative is elected to a 2-year term serving the people in a specific congressional district. The 6th congressional district is made up of Eastern Cobb County, Northern Fulton County, and the northern portion of DeKalb County. Among other duties, representatives' responsibilities are to introduce bills and resolutions, offer amendments, and serve on committees. Welcome, each of you, to our forum today. We are going to start this off like we did the last segment with a 2 or 3 minute opening statement, and we will start with Mr. Stephen Griffin Knight.
Good evening, everyone. I want to begin by extending my sincere thanks to the Cobb County Democratic Party for having us here this evening. It is a very serious matter that brings us to the table today, so thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. My name is Stephen Knight Griffin, and I am one of the candidates that is running to unseat Karen Handel in November. I'm told as a candidate, one of my greatest challenges is going to be making sure my name gets out there, and name recognition in particular. So I'm going to give you 3 reasons right now to remember who I am. 1, I am the candidate who shows up early and stays late. For me, this is about much more than FaceTime. I actually care about the issues that concern your family, and I want to help you solve them from a federal policy perspective. I'm open, I'm transparent, and I'm accessible. And I want to point out that I give out my personal email address, my personal phone number, because I love interacting with the constituents, and I love interacting with people individually and learning about their stories. That won't change once I'm elected. 2, I am the only candidate with the substance necessary to be an effective legislator from day one. You will never find me needing a script. You'll never find me needing tired platitudes or talking points, because I've actually worked in the policy field. I have experience there. And right now, that matters. The Trump administration is now, and we don't have time for a learning curve. 3rd, I am familiar with the sacrifice that will be necessary to win in November. At 12, I stood up to be the man of my family when my dad was nowhere to be found. At 26, only a few years out of college, I gave up every cent that I had saved as a young man to save my family home from foreclosure when my mom lost her job. And I did that because she was worth it. Most recently, I had to make one of the most difficult decisions of my life, leaving a job that I loved to run for this office at CDC. And I did that because you deserve a choice. You deserve a choice above and beyond career politicians, celebrities, and the wealthy. And you deserve that choice because you matter. Now, for me, this is real life with real risks. I don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars to live on or self-fund my campaign with. So I need your help, and I need your vote on May 22nd, because together we can take the battle to Karen in November, and together we can send a message to the Trump administration that they will not soon forget. My vow to you is that I've given you 3 reasons to remember my name. I will never forget your name, and I will never forget your story when I go to Washington. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. My first question deals with part of the roles and responsibilities of a congressperson, which is to serve on committees. If you became the next congressperson for the 6th Congressional District, what single committee would you like to serve on, and why, and what do you think you could bring to the table? Mr. Griffin, to you, sir.
Thank you for the question, Michael. So my first choice for committee assignment would be appropriations. And I think it's really important that we have a voice there, because we can talk about things like healthcare reform, about studying gun violence with the CDC, things of that nature. But if we can't actually fund our priorities in Congress, we can't get any of these things done. And I would be a loud and assertive voice in defense of Georgia families, in defense of our shared progressive values, and making sure that not only are our voices heard, but our priorities are funded.
Thank you. So next question does actually deal with healthcare. So what is the single largest challenge to healthcare reform, and what specific area would you push the most? Mr. Griffin, to you, sir.
So I would say at this point in time, the greatest challenge to the Affordable Care Act is the administration. They have shown time and time again that they will do whatever it takes to sabotage the law. And it's our job in Congress as a co-equal branch to demand that end. Now, there are a couple of things that we need to do to stabilize the marketplace above and beyond risk corridors. That's certainly part of the equation. But we need to reinstitute the ideas that we had as part of the original package, things like risk sharing, things like reinsurance, because collectively, these additional principles, coupled with the public option that I advocate, will meaningfully reduce premiums, expand coverage, and make sure people have not only access to health care, which is a Republican talking point, but coverage to get the care that they need. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question is to Mr. Griffin. Do you think that the White House should go ahead with its plan to continue offshore drilling? And if not, what plans would you like to put in place to allow us to have more robust energy sources?
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. So I would say that I think that the petroleum reserves that we have in this nation are better off underground. I think that we should not be exploiting additional oil resources in this country. That's not to say that we shouldn't be looking at ways to bridge the gap between the ideal future in which renewables make up 100% of our energy grid, but we have other options other than seaborne petroleum, which bears a host of risks above and beyond the simple extraction. So what I would propose to that end is tapping the resources that we do have, for example, natural gas, which is a far cleaner fuel, which has the capacity to meet energy needs and serve as a bridge fuel while we adapt and become more ready from a national perspective to actually move towards a greener grid that consolidates the best strengths of renewable energy while also acknowledging the realities that our energy needs shift from time to time. So I think that it should stay in the ground, Michael.
Thank you. And Mr. Griffin, sorry. So to follow up with that really quick, because I think there's no doubt amongst Democrats that we do believe in science, and climate change is in part and due to man-made interferences. So really quickly, what do you see as the most viable renewable energy source and why?
I think all of them in their own way are viable, and all of them will actually be part of the larger solution. When you look at the various ways that renewable energy is produced, for example, solar, wind, tidal energy, things of those nature, obviously the circumstances in which they are able to produce energy changes. For example, the sun isn't shining 24 hours a day, the wind isn't blowing 24 hours a day. So within the context of our renewable future, we need to make sure that we keep the boundaries quite large, that we not sign off on any potential renewable energy source. And to supplement that, we also need to be able to account for energy during the evening when solar production is lower, for example. And Tesla's made some great strides in developing battery storage, which is the missing link, in addition to smart metering, that will provide the bridge to a truly and endlessly renewable future from an energy perspective.
Thank you. Next several questions have to do with immigration. And the first question is, do you think it's fair to trade the border wall or enhance security to either protect our dreamers or give them a path towards citizenship? I think it's clear that Mexico will not be paying for a wall. So we make that understood very clearly. So with that said, though, what if we're in a situation to where you were a congressman and had to negotiate? What would be the thing, or what would be anything that you would be willing to negotiate in order to protect our 800,000 plus DACA recipients?
Let me be blunt. A border wall is a medieval solution to a 21st century problem, and I'm unwilling to make the Faustian bargain with this administration required for that wall to come to fruition. So what I would propose to that end is the bipartisan bill that's already been basically, it's gone through the motions. We already know that we have sufficient support to pass it. We just have a recalcitrant administration that refuses to consider things from a logical and common sense perspective. With additional people in Congress in November, which I suspect we will become from a much stronger position as far as bargaining goes. And I suspect that the willingness of the Republican Party to act in a bipartisan manner will reemerge once they have been put into a position where they actually have to talk with the other party again. And I suspect that we will see some great movement on immigration, including providing a pathway to citizenship for DACA enrollees, as well as a one-time amnesty for undocumented immigrants already here. Thank you.
Thank you. My last question along that line is kind of combines immigration with foreign trade. So has NAFTA done more to help or hurt the U.S. economy? And how would you like to see that negotiation of those trade agreements go into the future, Mr. Griffin?
So I think when you look at this from a free trade perspective and just from a basic economics perspective, the United States is able to do some things better than other countries, and other countries are able to do better some things than the United States. Free trade serves everyone in that way. Now, unfortunately, many of the benefits of free trade have not accrued to the people in this country. We've seen this time and time again where the government has allowed jobs to be outsourced. They have allowed H-1B visas to become basically the trading implement for outsourcing companies and for tech companies to avoid paying decent wages to Americans who are able to do the job, and that must end. So to that end, what I would call for is, while recognizing and acknowledging the massive benefits that free trade delivers, I would call for actually re-examining some of the fundamental elements that we have allowed corporations and multinationals to exploit our workers, because we really need to make sure that the industrial base in America remains cohesive. We need to make sure that people have options as far as their job, and they need to make sure that wages track productivity. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question deals with diversity. Very simply put, what would you do on Capitol Hill to try to ensure that the legislative body as a whole becomes more diverse? Mr. Griffin, same question.
I believe the question was about what we could do within Congress to make Congress more diverse. And I will point out that I am a gay man, but that is not the reason you should elect me. There are other things that we really need to discuss, kitchen table issues that affect average Americans. Now, to get to the question, I think it's really important that we remember Congress is not just people like us sitting up here running for office. It's also the staffers, the aides, people who keep the wheels of this government running. And one of the best things that we can do to encourage that diversity is get broad sects of society involved in the mechanisms of our government, because it's true. When you pull upon diversity in that way, when you pull upon different experiences in that way, we create the environment for just an expansion of what is possible within government and what is possible outside of government. And I've seen it in both ways. I've worked both within government and outside of it. And consistently what I've seen is when you get people from different walks of life involved in these things, the outcomes are better. People walk away with better understandings, not only of themselves, but of their neighbors. And so I think it's incumbent upon us as congressmen to make sure that we actually do promote diversity, not only amongst ourselves, but within our offices.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. Next question is one that's quite simple in nature. We have a unique president, to say the least. If there is one power, action, or thing that he does that you could, at snap of a finger, remove and stop him from doing immediately, what would you do, Mr. Griffin?
So I would do something that Congress can actually do. Actually, the Constitution delegates the Congress with war-making powers, and I don't trust the president with the war-making powers that he has been given by Congress under the blanket military fourth authorization that he has. So if I could snap my fingers and make it happen, that would be the very first thing that I would do, was remove that war powers, because I don't trust him to approach international relations with the stability and with the balance that we need, not only to protect our own safety, but those of our friends, our neighbors, and our allies. And I think that we really need to, as a co-equal branch of government, emphasize not only holding him accountable, but also reining in the worst of his excesses. And his unpredictability, some could argue that that might be beneficial from a geopolitical standpoint. I don't buy it. I think that we really need to rein in the worst of his practices, and we need to do so immediately.
Thank you. Staying with Donald Trump, it was recently said that it may be best for him not to be impeached and removed that way, but yet to be removed from the people through election as somewhat of a mandate. What do you think about that? Do you think he's conducted impeachable offenses? Would you support an impeachment of the president? Mr. Griffin, you first.
So earlier in the month or last month, I attended a town hall meeting with Tom Steyer that talked about this very topic, discussing the prospect of impeachment. And I want to point out that Robert Mueller's investigation is not yet complete. So I would say that while Trump has exhibited some troubling tendencies, I think that we need to wait on the evidence that the special counsel hopefully will be able to produce, or at least set the issue straight and put it to bed over the long term. And I think that elections are our way for holding officials accountable. Now, if we're dissatisfied with the way that he's moving things, the way that the direction is going in this country, we actually can use those very electoral processes to remove that power from him. For example, by flipping the House in November. That is one of the clearest ways that doesn't put Pence in power. It's one of the clearest ways to send a message, and it's one of the clearest ways to demand that he treat the people with the equanimity that we deserve, that he treat the people with what we expect, and that he rein in the worst of his impulses. Thank you.
Thank you. The president has made quite a name for himself in discussing issues around what can be seen as protectionism or nationalism. What is your thought about balancing nationalism with globalism and understanding the fact that, I think as Mr. Capel said, we do function in a global society today, but at the same time, there is some truth to the fact that we need strong American factories and workers and government. So, and Mr. Griffin, same question.
So thank you for the question, Michael. I think you're being kind by describing his approach as nationalism. I would more appropriately categorize it as jingoism. And I don't think that that's healthy or really sane from the perspective of where we're coming from in the world. The United States has a duty to itself, to its people, to provide the leadership necessary to lead us into the 21st century successfully. And by abdicating that leadership, I think he makes us both less safe and less free, here and abroad. Now, one of the best ways that we can promote peace here and abroad is by engaging in trade. And we need to make sure that that trade ultimately engenders a benefit or accrues a benefit to the American people. And we can do that without engaging in protectionist measures. What we can do is actually negotiate with our friends and allies. But the way the current administration is going, we're not going to have very many friends and allies left if we continue to conduct ourselves in this way. We can look at the Iran agreement as an example of that. That is us breaking our word. And if we continue to do things like that, how can we expect anyone to be willing to deal with us, even on a trade relation basis? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Capel.
Everyone in this room is a patriot. We all love this country, or we wouldn't be here today listening to us blabber on about how we think we can do better than the current administration. And the fact is, we can conduct and love our country, but still conduct ourselves with some respect and some decency, not only here in this country, but around the world. I am tired of seeing this administration stir up some of the worst instincts in this country. The race baiting, it's not healthy for a democracy. And when we talk to each other with respect and decency, it gives us a lot better chance to fix some of the issues that we all want to make better. Now, just briefly, around the world, we talk about this vacuum of leadership with the United States right now under this current administration, and we're seeing the consequences of that in the Middle East with people like China and also with Russia stepping into that vacuum to fill it and grabbing more power in places like Syria and around the world. I think that's one of the issues with his foreign policy as well.
Thank you. Last question around foreign policy, as you mentioned, is would you support a preemptive strike on North Korea, Iran, or any other country in an attempt to deter its nuclear capabilities? Mr. Griffin.
I think that's a very difficult question to approach from what we know outside of being actually elected officials.
What measures would you look at? What key things would you, as a congressman, look to see through intelligence to determine if and when it was appropriate time to do so?
Absolutely. So I think one of the best things to look at is whether there's an actual and proven and credible threat to people here, our allies abroad, basically geopolitical stability. Now, I'm not one of those people that thinks that we should proactively engage in military strikes unless it's absolutely called for. So what I would look for would be an impending threat. In other words, a decision has been made, it is going to happen, we need to react to it. I think that when we're dealing with potentially nuclear capable states, we have a very difficult decision ahead of us, because if we engage with these states, we create the potential for them to strike back at us, not just conventionally, but with nuclear weapons as well. And we need to realize that while Trump is while he's unpredictable, we can't really understand the mind of these foreign leaders either. And that's not to say that we should back down in the face of aggression, certainly not. We should be assertive and we should be clear about where we stand, but we also need to be balanced. And the current administration giving them carte blanche to proactively strike, I think, is a recipe for disaster. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. In addition to that, not only is it in the physical aspect, but also in cyberspace and other areas where we're seeing this. As it relates to that, what would you do specifically as a congressperson to counteract future incidences of Russia's meddling in not only our election system, but in our critical infrastructure in all areas? Thank you for that. Mr. Griffin.
So within the context of the question, last I heard, a paper ballot has never been hacked. So one of the very first things that I would propose to deal with Russian meddling in our elections is removing the capability for them to do so at all from a voting perspective. Now, obviously, that won't counteract their ability to intervene via social media. That's something that we'll need to address separately. But we have right here in Georgia, Georgia's very own 6th district, Diebold voting machines that use an ancient version of Windows which hasn't been updated in years. And if we're looking at cybersecurity as a holistic issue, in addition to being part and parcel of the electoral cornerstone that makes up our democracy, we need to have systems that are resilient, if not immune, to this kind of intervention. So that would be a place I start. And obviously, we need to engage in this on a much higher level. I'd love to see this kind of thing actually come about and be discussed on a much more holistic level, because addressing this just from one perspective is not going to solve the problem. We need to fundamentally rethink how we approach things from a cybersecurity perspective, and that's got to start with us.
Thank you. Next question is, do you think it's better for the United States to have an economy that's focused on the creation of goods or one that focuses more on services? Mr. Griffin.
So I think a healthy economy is going to focus on both things. Right now, we have a predominantly service-oriented economy. Historically, we've been industrially based. And I think the future is going to fall somewhere in between. But when we talk about what our future economic base is going to look like, we need to bear things in mind like automation. So even though we might see parts of the industrial base return to the United States, given our increasingly large advances as far as technology and AI, that doesn't mean it will accrue benefits to the workforce that exists right now. So in any event, regardless of how we ultimately try to spin the economy, we need to make sure that it works for everyone. And there's a couple of different ways that we can do that, but we need to start first and foremost by examining the ways that our economy works for people right now and the ways that it doesn't. Because in the absence of this understanding, we will never be able to confront the challenges of the 21st century as they pertain to the economy. And we will never be able to actually serve our people in a way that will not only promote productivity as well as economic activity, but also promote their well-being and increase their wages. Thank you.
Thank you. I know within the 6th Congressional District, there are many small businesses. However, large companies continue to encroach on that and steal away customers and shares. What would you do as Congressman to ensure that small businesses still have viability within the 6th District? Mr. Griffin.
I think there are a couple of ways that you can approach the plight of small businesses. We need to understand that first and foremost, healthcare premiums are a very real concern for a lot of small businesses. And a lot of the people that I've spoken to who run small businesses have to contend with that kind of thing, whether they're operating out of the exchange or whether they're purchasing private coverage via other options. So that's a great place for us to start. Another area is the tax code. And even though the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act ostensibly helps small businesses, it doesn't help all of them, and it doesn't help them uniformly. So we need to make sure that the tax code is arranged in such a way that it encourages entrepreneurship, it encourages people to go into business for themselves, and it facilitates their ability to do so. Lastly, we need to look at low or no interest loans for people who are willing to go out on a limb and try to establish businesses. We already have this in some form or fashion with the Small Business Administration, but it needs to be dramatically expanded. And we need to make sure that people know that these programs exist, they know how to access them, and that generally speaking, that these benefits are available to people because they enrich our lives, they enrich our communities, and they make us more economically powerful as well.
Thank you. Right, so we're going to keep it within the 6th Congressional District because the likelihood is that one of you could be our next congressperson. So the question is, what would be the most immediate concrete thing that we would see as having a Democrat, particularly one of you, as the next congressperson in the 6th? What would the 6th Congressional District, people of the 6th Congressional District, see as their immediate benefit to having you in office? And Mr. Griffin.
What my opponents have described are both acts that would require essentially a supermajority in Congress. And right now, we don't look poised to take the Senate quite as commandingly as we do the House. So realistically, the very first thing that I could offer the people of this district is something that we currently lack: true representation, accessibility, accountability, and transparency. And I've already done a lot to basically be the change that I want to see in that regard. It's like I said earlier, I have provided people with my personal phone number, with my personal email address, because I actually like to discuss these issues. I want to know your story. I want to know what your family is dealing with and see how I can help. And I think that those conversations are the basis for how we change the much larger legislative problems that we have in this country, is making sure that we understand our neighbors, that we understand their challenges, and then going forth, bringing those challenges with us to Washington, putting the human face on the legislation that we're fighting for, because we can't do that overnight. We can make promises, but that's what politicians do already. We need to be realistic, and we need to go into this with the understanding that this is going to be a battle, and you need to send a fighter, someone like me, to Congress to make sure it's seen to fruition. Thank you.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of this section of the forum. So what I'd like to do now is for us to start our closing statements. So Ms. Macbeth, you could please.
Thank you. Most certainly, I am not a politician. I didn't grow up wanting to become a politician, and I didn't lay out a plan, a career plan to become a politician. I am simply a mother, a daughter, a taxpayer, a human being, a woman who's lost her child to unnecessary gun violence. And what I do know, and the experiences that I've had over these last 20, 30 years, is that what people need is a sense of hope. What people need to know, what people want to know each and every day of their lives is that, am I going to be able to keep food on the table? Am I going to be able to pay my bills? Are my children going to be able to have a good education? Am I going to be able to have good health care? Am I going to be able to make sure that I can help provide for my parents while they're aging? Can I have the democracy that the United States says that I am afforded? And what I can promise you is that a lot of these issues and concerns that you have, this has been my reality. This has been my experience. So no, I don't come to you with numbers and figures and facts. I come to you with an open heart, wanting to serve you as your public service, having you hold me accountable to be an open voice for you, carrying your needs to Washington. I want to offer you hope. And that's what I will do for you in Washington each and every day. I will be accountable to you, my neighbor, and that's why I want to represent you in Washington. And I pray that you would find that I am acceptable to do so.
Thank you, Ms. Macbeth. Mr. Cable.
Thank you. We're 2 weeks out from, less than 2 weeks now, wow, from an election. I've been on the campaign trail 7 days a week, day and night, along with everybody else on this stage. One of the things I wanted to make sure that I did for my family is at least 4 or 5 nights a week is to put my children to bed. They're 2.5 years old. They're twins. And they each like to pick out different books every night. My daughter, Alice, always picks the same book, and it's called You're Here for a Reason. Now, on a certain page, it says, even the smallest of things that you do blossom and multiply far beyond you. And we're raising our kids in a household that knows that no act of kindness is too small, and that all of our actions have consequences. We've seen them in the last election. Last summer, when they were trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act, my wife and I would stay up late every time they would have one of those midnight votes, and we'd hold our breath. Millions of Americans were calling their legislators, begging them not to strip their health coverage away. And when you're calling for your life, or your twins' lives, you can no longer sit in my position in a newsroom and simply report on this anymore. All of our actions have consequences. I'm throwing my hat in the ring here because I care deeply about this community and the future, not only for our children, but for all of our neighbors and for this country. We are at a crossroads right now, and we're going to have an opportunity to change the direction of this country. We've got to take it. Thank you.
And Mr. Griffin, your closing statements.
I make it a point to read the news on a regular basis, and one of the things that always sticks out to me is the fact that there is one entity that is consistently less popular than this president. I know it's a surprise considering his approval ratings are consistently in the toilet, but Congress is that group that is less popular than the president. And it always begs a question. Why is that? Considering that we have the opportunity to elect our representatives every 2 years, it would seem that we would have the opportunity to get rid of these people that ostensibly, according to the polls, we so deeply despise. And I think going back to what I said earlier, we send a couple of groups in particular to Washington time and time again. We send the wealthy, we send career politicians, and we send celebrities. And we raise our hands and question, why do these groups consistently drive the country into the ground? And I'll tell you, it's because we don't vote them out of office. This district is special in that we have an opportunity right now to walk away from that, to choose a better path. And while I would say I am only one person, I will also say I will never lie to you. I won't make a promise that I can't keep. And I depart from the traditional political approach in that sense. I think that we need more authenticity in Washington. I think we need more accessibility in Washington. And if you feel as I do, and if you think as I do, I will point out again, you have a choice. And you have that choice up until May 22nd. So if you want a change, if you want things to go differently in this country, if you really want to be the change that you tell your friends and your family, you have that opportunity. But you need to exercise your vote on May 22nd. And I hope that you will join me in sending a message, not just to the Trump administration, but to the electoral powers that be and to the party powers that be. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin, and thank you to all three of you. Thank you for stepping up to run for office, and best of luck May 22nd.